Indigenous peoples. And I am grateful to welcome, first off, I am Reverend April Johnson, Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. And I am grateful to welcome our moderator and panelists tonight. Our moderator tonight is Reverend Dave Bell. He serves as Minister for Indigenous Peoples Concerns. He is also the Director of Yakima Christian Mission, and he is a core trainer for Reconciliation Ministry for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Welcome, Dave. Our next panelist is Crow Eddie, and Crow is from a Mi'kmaq artist in Nova Scotia, Canada. He is a member of the North American Council on Truth and Reconciliation and a member of the Center for Indigenous Ministries Disciples of Christ Council. In the spring and fall, he leads healing circles hosted by Milton Christian Church. Welcome, Crow. And then our third panelist is my namesake, April Burrows, and she is from a leadership team at Sugar Bush Christian Church in Guelph, Ontario. That's in Canada. And she is joining us as a representative of the Sugar Bush Christian Church there in Guelph. Pedro Ramos is our fourth panelist, and Pedro Ramos Goy Colea serves as the pastor of Desert Dove Christian Church in Tucson, Arizona, and he's also the co-chair of the Anti-Racism and Pro-Reconciliation team in Arizona, and also a trainer for Reconciliation Ministry. Welcome to all of you all. We are very excited, and we've had a lot of energy around this topic. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you would go ahead and speak with our panelists. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, April. Thank you for having us and being a part of such important work through reconciliation and the work that you do. I'd like to start us off with a simple land of acknowledgement, recognizing that both in the United States and Canada, we all find ourselves on the land of ancient peoples. And so each of us find ourselves in different places. But for me, I would welcome you to join me in my landscape and recognize the ancient folks of the Yakima people here. And recognize that as we do here that it is their bones and the water that was once them that feed us and give us strength and remind us that we are never alone. And that because of that, we matter in the same way that they mattered. And to know that to be able to be in the land that we are in, we get to be there because of the people who have gone before us. And so we are excited to be with you today, myself and the panelists, and we thought we'd take a little bit of time to talk about a little bit of who we are and where we come from, and doing that by throwing names. So what I would like to just do is ask each panelist to begin with, just tell us your name and tell us what that means. And so I'll go through as I see you on my screen. And April, would you let us know a little bit about who you are through your name?
Sure. So my name is April Dawn, and Gostick was my original name from my family of origin. And I was given that name because I was born in the dawn of the month, how my mother described it. And my birthday is actually in April. My spirit name is Odomengizazanankwe, Strawberry Moon Star Woman, given to me by my elder Mary Lou Smoke on my 50th birthday to honor our connection and my journey. So those are my names. Did you want more than that?
Thank you. That's great, April. Perfect. And Pedro, would you gift us as well?
So I actually have a very long name, which is not unusual for Hispanic families, for Mexican families. My full name is Pedro Antonio Ramos Goicolea, and is oftentimes impossible to make that fit in a registration form or anything like that. But I was named after both my grandfathers on my mother's side and my father's side, and both my last names are the I guess the heritage of colonization. In I am from Sonora, Mexico, the border state with Arizona, and I think my family is the heritage of that colonialism, and my full entire name sort of reflects that the regions from Spain that came to the place where I am from, as well as the communities that the peoples that inhabited that land long before the colonization.
Great. Thank you, Pedro. And Crow, would you gift us your name?
Sure. Crow Eddie, in the Mi'kmaq language, crow is Gakaguch. And if you listen to it phonetically, Gakaguch. So it sounds like the bird, the crow. When people ask me about their spirit animals or things related to that, what I tell them is our understanding is based on logic and common sense, on observation of nature. So, like crow, you would look at what a crow does, how a crow lives, how a crow shapes its life. And this is usually what I tell people that ask me this question. Look at what your spirit animal does. I know there's a lot of guides and information to what crows mean, and I find it it's more of a Western tradition, and like I previously mentioned, in our tradition, we look to that animal. We spend our time observing that animal. My spirit name was given to me by an Ojibwe elder, so it is not in Mi'kmaq, it's in Ojibwe, and it is Badabin. And Badabin means that first light you see in the morning, just before the sun comes over the horizon.
Great. Thank you, Crow. Thank you, Pedro. And thank you, April. That was great stuff. So let's move into what we're here for, and to say to everyone that we certainly have a panel here. We'll ask some questions, but don't be surprised if it moves more towards a conversation among panelists and in that natural way as things come together. What I'd like to begin us with is that we know disciples as a whole have used the phrase westward movement as one way to define themselves. The idea of West, though, was an expansionist Great Commission identity rather than directional. We hear this in 1852 when Alexander Campbell wrote, "In our country's destiny is involved the destiny of Protestantism, and in its destiny, the destiny of all the nations of the world. God has given an awful charge to Protestant England and Protestant America, and he was sure to make sure that you knew who he meant, the Anglo-Saxon race, the fortunes not of Christendom only, but of all the world." Non-Anglo-Saxon Indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada were a hindrance to our disciple settler colonist forepeople, which in part led disciples to open the American Teepee Christian Mission in 1921, whose goal was to remove children from their Indigenous parents and in turn Christianize and civilize them into disciples of Christ, morals, and ethics. So I'm wondering, panel, due to our supremacist identity in 1852 and 1921, we seldom grasp our complicity in the racist acts of church and society. What modern expansionist acts do you believe are currently affecting Indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada? And Pedro, why don't we begin with you?
Sure thing. So perhaps the most visible symbol that we currently have of westward expansion and supremacist sentiment that fueled the concept of manifest destiny, the burden of the Protestant church, is the southern border, or at least the one closest to me, but more specifically, the construction of a border wall. During the 1800s, America's expansionist motives had no consideration for indigenous peoples inhabiting the land. They didn't care for their ways, their existence, because the settlers' ways, thought to be superior, well, they had to be imposed as the norm of the land. And I believe that the same sentiment continues to shape public opinion nowadays, and serves as basis, for instance, to justify border militarization and the construction of the wall. We're all affected by these policies. If we thought that it was a problem of the border only affected undocumented migrants, well, we were proved wrong just recently. We just saw Border Patrol tactical units deployed in Portland, Oregon, harassing and detaining protesters. But the people that are most affected and have been most affected by America's expansionist acts continue to be indigenous peoples. I live in Tucson, Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert, and this is the ancestral grounds of the Tohono O'odham, which means desert people. And the O'odham peoples, the O'odham people's culture and language and traditions, they survived the Spanish colonization. They have survived the forced assimilation of the boarding school system, but their struggle continues to this day. And this fight is perhaps the one that presents the most danger for them. Because for the Tohono O'odham, resisting the border wall is not an option. It's essential for survival. Resisting the border wall means reclaiming the right to exist. The O'odham peoples, their being, their existence and survival are intrinsically connected to the preservation of the land. And the construction of an 18-feet high wall, it means the complete displacement of the O'odham people, irreversible damage to the fragile ecosystem of the desert, the destruction of ancestral graves, the vanishing of the religious traditions and practices, and complete loss of their connection to the land. So I want to wrap it up with this. For the Tohono O'odham, land is sacred. Land is sanctuary. Because elder brother Itoy put you in this land. And this desert land extends as far north as to what is now Phoenix, Arizona, USA, and south to Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico. And in the mind of the O'odham people, borders don't exist. As a matter of fact, the concept of wall, the word wall, it doesn't exist in Tohono O'odham language. Ofelia Rivas is an indigenous rights activist in the area, and she described the wall in this way. She says, it's like somebody put a knife on your mother and you can't pull it out. And when I heard that quote, it just gave me chills because it gives us an idea of the pain and the struggle that the O'odham peoples are going through right now, and their struggle to survival, which is oftentimes overlooked and ignored by public, by the news, and by our very communities here in the borderlands and beyond.
Thank you, Pedro. And I think that matters a lot. I don't think we hear much about our southern border when it comes to Indigenous people, and to know a little about what's going on with the Tohono O'odham matter greatly. April, what are your thoughts, either on what Pedro's gone or with the question? What do you think about borders?
Crow had his mute off first, so I'll be happy to let Crow go first, if that's what you were looking for, Crow.
Sure. With the issue of borders, the Mi'kmaq people have been suffering from this kind of division for a long time between Canada and the United States. My ancestors were travelers. I don't want to say nomadic because they weren't nomadic people. They were semi-nomadic, winter in the forest, summer at the ocean. But they were travelers, and traveling was a very important part of existence. Going across the Bay of Fundy, they would into the United States. They would have met up with relatives, with old friends, with brothers and sisters and cousins. They would also pair up their children, as part of the necessity of a clan system is to see that your children are actually married outside your immediate family group. And this would take place in the summertime during these excursions. And the summer was quite a time of celebration, of going to other families, other tribal settlements. So they would be going across the Bay of Fundy. To this day, there's still a large Mi'kmaq community in Boston. And so the traveling was quite extensive. An older friend of mine's grandfather, so you can imagine how many generations ago that would be, how long ago that would be. Him and his wife took a canoe trip from Nova Scotia to Ganawage, Quebec. This is for us. This is an incredible feat to even think of. To them, this was going to see relatives and families in Ganawage, and they spent 2 years there. Of course, you're not just going to go for the summer that far, and return. So it really points to how freely we traveled around. If we look at the Mi'kmaq known as Dr. Lone Cloud, which he is quite well written about, because he shared his stories with a museum curator. And he traveled around the United States and did a lot of exploring. His parents were traveling medicine people. These were all just part of our culture, which was ended when the United States and Canada created these borders. Something kind of came up on a contemporary note that kind of struck a chord with me, that the Mi'kmaq Nation, which covers Nova Scotia, parts of the United States, parts of New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, parts of Newfoundland. So it's quite a large territory, and parts of Gaspé, Quebec. The Mi'kmaq Nation in Gaspé, Quebec, in Listagouche, just recently due to the COVID virus, where their reserve is close to the border of New Brunswick, and that's where they would go to do all their shopping, get groceries, necessities, things like that. When the government decided to close provincial borders, that left that reservation in jeopardy, because now they could no longer obtain the things that they required to survive and continue. So this idea of borders and native peoples, it's something that has been imposed on us, and I love what Pedro said. The damage it not only does to us, but the damage that it does to nature and the environment. April?
Sure. So just to acknowledge that everything I've learned mostly as a helper to Dan and Mary Lou Smoke. I often would travel with them and drive them to different talks, and I would be their helper for the day, basically taking care of them, making sure they have water and food or anything that they would need of me. Sometimes I would be allowed to participate in the smudge, depending on who is there. Both of them have trouble walking, so often I would have the honor of doing that. So everything I've learned has been from them, and or I was a part of a committee in Guelph, Ontario here, where we were looking at trying to really advocate for the curriculum, the school curriculum, to be changed in our school district, because well, quite frankly, the material that we had in our school system were all lies. Nothing of truth was really being told about the history in Canada of our Indigenous people. And so because the education minister was in our community, and just because it was the right thing to do, we spent a year or so, and it was a committee of 3 Indigenous elders and then 3 community members, non-Indigenous community members. So we worked towards that. And so through learning from Indigenous elders, this is where all the information I have comes from. It is not my information. I continue to learn and grow and educate myself all the time on the issues. So I just wanted to put that out there. It is not my wisdom that I'm sharing with you today. I just wanted to make that really clear. So I was really stunned when I started writing some notes down of the things that I've learned and the things that have shocked me, because I was blind before I was exposed to the truth. So the things that I know are only from the Canadian perspective. So what I know today that is still a huge effect is that many, if not most, or maybe all of our reserves or Indigenous communities live in what we used to call third world conditions. So no clean water, little access to proper health care, all kinds of issues that Canadians are still not aware of, not addressing, not supporting, not forcing our government to address fairly. In the Canadian North, in particular, I think in our Inuit communities, the cost of food is absolutely atrocious. I'm going to make a guess, but it's something like if it was $2.99 for a bag of milk here, it would be $12, $13, $14, $15 in the North. And that one company pretty much owns the rights and has gouged our Indigenous people all this time. And we should be, if it's the cost that much to have food shipped up there, then we should be subsidizing that so that it's fair. Some communities are still under a law that requires them to get permission from the government to even have a will, to will things to their children because of the treaties, whether they've been signed or not. The amount of funds that go to the schools in Canada on reserves is significantly lower to the public schools in Canada, which was another thing that shocked me. How can we value children differently? Right there is racism, 100%. Due to the genocide, both cultural, and I use the word genocide not lightly. It's hard for me to say, but it's true. Not just cultural genocide. I think we're going to find eventually that it wasn't just cultural genocide. I think we're going to find something someday. That's my own belief, and as I've been looking at it, but it has a huge emotional impact on Indigenous communities, and will have, I think, for generations to come. Our children's services, our children's protective services, is been proven and shown lots of signs of discrimination, still taking children when they shouldn't be taking children, and discriminating against families. One that I've been really working in myself lately is the issues around our prison systems. We have a continuously growing number and disproportionate amount of Indigenous inmates, and our Canadian Mounted Police have had lots of criticism and charges against them for discrimination, and there's lots around that. Land is still trying to be developed on which we should not be developing. I've read some stuff around our mining communities. A lot of times we're not hearing about that, feeling that they have the right, or they're aware that Indigenous communities are not getting, they should be benefiting. If it's on their land, they should be benefiting, and a lot of times they're not. And the same with the oil industry. And historically, I saw Dan Smokes shared with me a map once where it showed how a lot of industries were built upstream from our reserves, therefore polluting their water, and that you wouldn't see a lot of that. And so there's a bit of history there. I'm not sure if that's true now, but where they would make sure that they weren't built upstream to white communities. That's just obvious when you think of that. And then another one that's very close to my heart is the whole issue around missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. I know personally 2 families. One is Mary Lou Smoke's sister, who was murdered in Toronto. And the police basically didn't even bother investigating, just kind of threw it aside. They're still trying to figure out what happened. And I shared that one because Dan and Mary Lou can't march in the march. I often march for them. And carry a picture of their sister. So they've asked me to do that several times for them. And so you feel it when you're there. You feel it when you're protesting against this. It gets into your bones. And another family member whose daughter was killed by one of Canada's famous serial killers out in the West. So I have a few family, like personal connections, and it's those connections that have really opened my eyes. And I always figure once you know, you can't unknow, and once you know, you're responsible. And so that's how I have felt. I have felt responsible to educate myself and learn everything I can so that I am not a part of the problem. I can be a part of the solution. So that's what I know. That's what I know so far.
Thank you, April. I think that becomes an important piece of when we move from genocide into murder and missing Indigenous women in the United States and Canada, and how that all comes together, that something needs to be done. And a big piece of this peace and reconciliation is around action. And it makes me think of a question that a friend of mine raised this week. Blue Eagle McCutcheon had asked that that being the case, that there's so much going on, and recognizing that there's so little that is known. by the general public when we really do talk about the history of boarding schools, the incredible genocide that went on in both of our two nations, and today, in a very modern sense, the enormous level that there is of missing and murdered Indigenous women that nothing's been done about. I think Blue Eagle would have us ask if y'all, what would you say are first steps that any congregation might take towards Indigenous justice, of doing something about this? And April, I'd like to start with your voice, since you ended us, and help us move down this road. What do congregations do? What might we do to make a difference?
So I get a little stumped with the word "do," because I worry that as a denomination, and I'm sort of a serial church person, so I've been through a lot of denominations: the United Church, the Baptist Church, the Disciples, just because I keep running up against theological challenges. So I'm not a bad person. I don't move around, but I'm just kidding. So the doing, I think that's part of the challenge, is that we want to just go in and fix, and we don't want to learn. And to me, this is more about a new way of being with people, new way of being together, and a new way of knowing ourselves, and acknowledging how hard it is to know that our ancestors did this and our denominations did these sorts of things. But we have to allow ourselves to feel them. I know for me, change, and what I know about change, is that when we get close to the truth, our old ways try to pull us back to the same way of thinking, because it's our egos want us to stay put. It's scary, but I think for me, and what I've been taught, is listen. You have 2 ears. This is what Dan and Mary Outley always tell you: you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you need to listen at least twice as much. And so I've learned that. Don't be afraid of being corrected, because we need to be corrected. So if somebody of an Indigenous person corrects you, thank them for that correction, because it's a teaching in itself. And educate yourself, like really educate yourself. To me, those are some of the very first things. Just be careful about the doing. I work in international development with another organization, and we work with Indigenous communities all over Africa, Asia, and Mexico. And it's about standing together. It is not doing for anybody. It's about doing everything we can do to empower the voices that need to be heard. So I would say we need to stand with Indigenous communities and demand our governments to put in Canada anyways. The political voice was very strong back in the 60s, and it's not so much anymore. But I think as churches, we should stand up and demand our governments to, I won't get into some of the stuff because it might be a bit more too controversial, but to look at the school systems, demand the curriculum to be changed. Look at the how unfair it is. We can be political voices, and we should be political voices for the proper kinds of change. So I know we're saying congregations, but we're a strong group of at least in Canada, the amount of people who volunteer from churches is way huger than pretty much any other group. So why not use our volunteerism and our ethics around volunteerism to move forward and really demand our governments to make the kinds of changes that is going to bring equality and healing. But it's really more, to me, about listening and learning, and then using our voice to stand with, not for, but with Indigenous communities.
Great. And Pedro, Crow, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with April, and the thing is, in part because those are some of the theologies we've been taught since we're children, that we have the good news, and we have that the Great Commission, right, of going out and bringing good news to people as if we're the fixers of everything, because we bring the good news with us. But I think there, in every congregation, there is a reservation that is close by, and I think so my congregation is about 75 miles from the border with Mexico, and the first thing that comes to mind when wanting to take my church outside is going to Mexico, to the border. But I think a great and a very growing, spiritually nurturing experience is to go and hang out with our brothers and sisters. And going to the casino doesn't count as going to a reservation. But really going and sitting at a restaurant or whatever and just connecting with folks one-on-one and having conversation and learning. I think we're missing a lot because there is so much wisdom that we can learn and we can bring to our pulpits and share with our congregations in terms of understandings of having new understandings about land and sacred places, and honoring our ancestors, like just honoring those who have been before us and have showed us the paths that we ought to walk. Like I think that's a huge thing that sometimes we miss in our churches, because we're always looking at tomorrow, at the future, at what's coming that's best, that we forget to look back. And that's something that I've learned from connecting with the Tohono O'odham communities, is what your ancestors are telling you. What are they teaching you? What's the path that they walk and you're not looking at?
And Crow, how are your thoughts about our congregations?
I think that April started us off on the right track with education. Education is like doing. How do we look at it? How do we define it? What is it? I think our contact with our Native brothers and sisters is education in itself. What I have found, and I'm in public selling my arts to a lot of non-Native people, so I get a lot of questions arise, which is quite wonderful, helps me build those bridges. But one thing I've started to notice is from a non-Native population, people seem to be looking more at the fact that Native people are like a reenactment. So we should have the rights we had in the past only. We should dress the way we dressed in the past. I mean, a powwow is an amazing thing to witness and a very spiritual thing to take in. But the indigenous nations of North America go so much further and beyond that. And there are natives that are doctors. There's natives that are lawyers. There's natives in all functions and walks of life. And I think as we educate ourselves, we can't just look to the past, that we have to look at what is actually part of the native structure today, and enlighten ourselves on how um, how things have been dealt with, problems have been dealt with using traditional native knowledge. An example, I'm trying not to be confusing, an example there would be in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. The Mi'kmaq in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia are considered somewhat champions in the country of Canada, in that other Native nations have gone to them to look at their model of their school system and their model of how to teach the language, and make sure that the language stays alive amongst the people. They're also haven't they, in Cape Breton, they had like a lot of native communities, they had a nightmare period where a lot of their children were committing suicide. So what they did was, rather than go straight to Western psychology and Western medical practices, they paired with those practices and created a system that was also part Western psychology and part native spiritual understanding of nature. So the young people are that seek them out for help, or who are sent to them for help, are involved in they don't go into an office to talk. They sit outside around an open fire to talk, things that are familiar to our hearts, and things that have been with our traditions for millennia. So I think as we educate ourselves, and we educate ourselves about the wrongs, of course, the residential schools, the murdered Indigenous women, these are things that we really, the public really needs to be aware of. They also need to be aware of our strengths, and what we have to offer our respective nations.
Thank you, Crow. That's helpful. Thank you, April and Pedro. And I think it's each of those are incredibly important comments and things we need to hear closely. And I think that each of those should enter into our congregations, and our congregations giving thought to how do we go about this and how do we live this out in our lives. And certainly one of those that I think that in an earlier conversation with April that I was reminded of is that as we started today, is the idea of doing a land acknowledgement every time you start a worship service. It's a simple piece, but it's always going back to the ancient people and the landscape in which you live. It's simple, and yet it is how can we be a spiritual people without recognizing the spirit of those who've gone before us. So I think that's one way, at least one other way that we go about that. I know we have a lot of questions out there, and what I'd like to do at this time is turn this over to our moderator, Shannon Pope of the OGMP, and have her help us through questions that have come up from the public.
Thank you, David. Yes, there are lots of questions that are coming in. Let's see. In the U.S., a significant problem related to the murder of Indigenous women is that only certain federal authorities can investigate. Is there a similar issue in Canada?
Do you want to speak to that, Crow? I don't know if I quite have the answer to it, but I could try. Do you want to try it, Crow? Or do you want me to try?
there. I couldn't get my mic on. Yeah, there's definitely if you could stick with me on this, April, and help me out. There's I think we could both answer this question that there definitely is a serious problem in Canada. Um, the Native communities have done a lot to try and make the public aware of the problem, but most of the public relies on the media for their understanding, and the media has fallen quite short on anything to do with Native communities and their situation of being what I would call imprisoned on reservations rather than free on the land. Um, so I know here in Nova Scotia, there has been in the Native communities quite a lot of events taking place and things happening to try and create this awareness, but it doesn't seem to be receding as a crime problem. I'm not sure myself on, and I don't want to enter into it on what the RCMP the position is, what the police position is on this historically. I am aware that for the most part, like you mentioned, April, that a lot of these situations have been grossly ignored. And yeah, do you have anything to add, April?
Maybe just more practically, and I really only know Ontario, but so typically our policing system, the investigation is done where the crime happened. So if it was in, say, Toronto, then it would be the Toronto Police. But if it was in a rural community, it's covered by the Ontario Provincial Police, or the OPP. So it really is whoever is district it is to police, then that's who would be responsible for the investigation. And as far as I know, that it's not a matter of who, it's a matter of if they will. It's a matter of priority, and the priorities have not been put towards the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there still is I agree with Crow. You can, if you look for it, if you want to look for it, and we have some really good Indigenous websites and a TV station that tells much more of the truth. And I watch APTN all the time in Canada, which is, and you'll find more accurate truth about what investigations are happening or what's happening than you can on our general media, I guess. So that's all I can think of adding.
Thank you for that. The next question reads, in the sense that Oklahoma over the last several decades has seen a large increase in tribal-based casino gambling with all the attendant consequences, how does the DOC Church and you each individually grapple with the evident economic benefits with the attendant potential ambiguities of addiction, family tension, and destruction of a given life?
I'll start with that, Shannon, to say that what I'm hearing, the way it's framed, is as if Indigenous people benefit from casinos on reservations, and I think the premise is just simply wrong. Is that we have to begin with the historical trauma that started centuries ago, that took people and misidentified them and shuffled them off to reservations, to reserves, and that type of thing. And that today the struggle, so that when we talk about addiction and family tensions and destructions of a given life, is that this is something that has its base in the doctrine of discovery, has the base in empire building, And that when we get to the idea of casinos and tribal peoples having casinos, is that there's money coming in, there's no doubt about that, but it starts to build a base by which folks can put together medical facilities, education for their children, and start building back to not what was, but to move out of the trauma of a people today. So that's kind of where I would begin with it.
Anyone else want to make a statement? There's one other question. There are lots of them that we'd like to get in before we hit the top of the hour and we move to our call to action. Okay, if not, can we get a quick response to how do we as Christians and members of our respective nations work and speak against the realities of borders? Anybody?
I guess I can speak a little bit about that.
Okay.
And the thing is that there are a lot of ramifications that that grow out of border policies, which have been in development for quite some time, and to a point that border security, it's become an intrinsic, has been institutionalized in the country's economy. And so all border communities now are heavily dependent on the federal budget that is approved for border communities. And when it becomes intrinsic, when it becomes so intrinsic in the fabric of society and the fabric of border communities, then it becomes hard to entangle that and like go back to a thing that was. So I think it's important to educate our communities with facts and truths that speak truth to power, and to start demanding accountability from Border Patrol, from ICE, from U.S. Customs Enforcement, from all the different law enforcement groups that are working at the border. Right now, there shows a complete lack of accountability because everything is done under the Department of Homeland Security. So it's really hard to know who is out there, what are they doing, and when there is an injustice done in the community, for instance, the killing of a teenager on the Mexican side, there hasn't been zero accountability. So I think it's important, one, to educate our communities, and two, start demanding accountability from these law enforcement agencies and asking for our politicians to create those structures, those bodies that will hold accountable these police agencies.
Thank you very much. As we approach the 8 o'clock hour, thank you to all the guests who have provided many questions and to our panelists for their answers. But this is called Love is an Action Word, and there wouldn't be action if we didn't have our wonderful Reverend April Johnson coming to bring us to our call to action as well as our closing. Thank you.
I want to first say thank you to our panelists, to April, and to Crow, to Pedro, and to David. Thank you so much for sharing out of the wealth of your knowledge, but out of and your wisdom as well, but really out of your hearts and your desire. We pray our shared desire for us to be discomforted so that we can return to the spiritual people, as Dave reminds us, that we have all been called to be. And so I want to echo everything that said. The call to action, each of our panelists gave us a call to action. And what I have been doing over the past few months, as we have been in these conversations, either over at the water cooler or on webinars like this, is just three simple things. And the first one, is to continue to learn. And I really appreciated a couple of things that David said to us, and that is every time we gather, can we learn about the land which is under our feet and take time to acknowledge that land? It is a spiritual practice, and we are spiritual people. And it's really important that we do that learning, but we also acknowledge the land that we stand on or sit on, in my case right now, was never our own. So, and what we can learn from that. So continue to learn. The second piece that I invite you all to always do is to connect. Um, there are so many opportunities. I liked April's response around let's be careful about doing before we have been invited to accompany, to walk alongside. So let's connect with people that are interested in this inquiry, that want to have this conversation with you. We've been given some disturbing information because racism is a very disturbing evil in our lives. And so we only are disrupted so that we can be um, reconstructed to do the work that brings healing to both our land and to our people. So do connect with other people to have conversations. There's some comments about land rights. There were comments about or information about what is happening to Indigenous people in North America. That would be the United States and Canada. Sometimes we forget that North America is the United States and Canada. So connect with people who have interest in those areas so that we just don't stay in shock and awe, but we actually become movement people for the right kind of movement of God. And then lastly, I want to ask you to commit. Commit to supporting this work. Obviously, we want you to commit to supporting Reconciliation Ministry as our special offering is approaching quite quickly. Our theme is The Rocks Are Crying Out. And I believe that these webinars and what our panelists are sharing with us is allowing us to recognize that we can join in the chorus and to say that this historic trauma that Dave pointed out to us is not the end of our story, nor is it the beginning of our story. So that if we can cry out and show up, speak up, and stand up on behalf of our siblings from whatever corners of the earth that they come from, then we can literally be actors in healing our land. And I would say our hearts as well. So my heart is full tonight. If you can't tell, I'm so grateful for our panelists. I'm so grateful for all over 150 of you who joined us tonight. Ask that you would join us again on Thursday, August 27th, where we will be having Love is an Action Word webinar with our North American Asian Pacific Disciples Ministry of our church, and they will be looking at the policies and practices of disciples in North American Pacific Asian disciples. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And again, thank you so much for our panelists and for Shannon. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.